Hi, I'm attorney Greg Dell, joined by attorney Steven Dell, and we have the opportunity to discuss one of Steven's recently resolved cases against MetLife. And Steve, this was a case where a claimant contacted you where they had already started the application process, and a lot of people call you even before or in the middle or prior to a denial, and then you get involved. But in these videos, we like to talk about what you needed to do for the particular client so that people can learn if they have a particular case, how can a lawyer help me to apply for benefits? So give us a little bit of the background of this particular case against MetLife.
Greg, this is a claim involving a dissociative identity disorder known as a DID. Years ago it was known as dual personality, but psychologists and psychiatrists no longer use that nomenclature. This young fella in his 30s is an entrepreneur, and the symptoms of his DID were dual personality, severe depression, anxiety, disorientation as to time and place, and at times was hallucinating to the point that he thought he was someone else. He had a second personality within. And it obviously interfered with the multiple businesses that he owned. And ultimately, with the help of his dad, who's an accomplished businessman, he filed the claim. Now, it was Dad who basically did the majority of the claim, but it was only initial filing. I'd like to file a claim, please send me an application, filled in the first page, and then threw their hands up saying, this is a lot more complicated than I thought.
So they had already notified the carrier, as opposed to other cases where people call you and they haven't even notified the carrier at all.
Majority of claims, clients will call me from inception before they even know what their policy says. On occasion, someone gets involved in the application process and realizes this is not a venue I want to enter.
Okay. When you took on this case, and this particular claimant was so dysfunctional with his mental nervous condition that you dealt with what was his father and also acting in a guardian capacity, basically, for your client?
Actually, Greg, I spoke very little to the claimant. Most of my conversation was with his dad.
So what steps did you need to take in this particular claim in order to get the client approved for benefits?
Well, as I do in any claim, and I considered this tantamount to a new application, I sent a letter that I had dictated based upon the facts that I took from the initial interview, and identified 20 or so bullet points, which were documents that I needed. And that included, first and foremost, psychiatric records, and of course business records, profit and loss statements, tax returns, things of that sort. Understanding what were the substantial material duties of this particular claimant's occupation, because just because you're called an entrepreneur, you could have multiple different job responsibilities. How much was he actually hands-on? And so following the receipt of that letter, his dad started working on getting me all of the records and everything I asked for. He was rather efficient.
At what point in time did you notify MetLife that you were involved in the claim?
As soon as they reached out to me, because I didn't want MetLife to proceed in analyzing the claim with nothing there. There's something in almost every disability insurance policy, whether it's a group plan or a private disability, and this was an individual disability policy, meaning that it was procured on the open market through an agent in a negotiation to purchase the policy, as opposed to being provided by the employer. And I advised him that I was going to contact the carrier at inception so that they didn't start working the claim during the proof of claim period, which is 90 days, which is a requirement upon the insured to prove their claim. And proof of claim means provide all the documents necessary to show that the claimant meets the definition of disability under the policy. So I notified Met. Met reached out to me, and then the process started in reviewing data that I had collected and submission to the carrier.
Okay. So once you got the opportunity to see all the medical records, were you then ready to go ahead and submit an application, or were there other things that you needed to do for this particular claim?
I was ready to submit a good part of the application, not the entirety of the application, because I didn't have everything I needed. Claimants often don't understand the intricacy of a claim and the right that the insurance company has in most instances, and of course this is defined by the policy, to really get into specific data that they want. P&Ls over a 3-year period, to many people, is intrusive. Many people say, why would I give my personal tax return? That has nothing to do with my inability to do what I did before. So I sent what I had to show good faith on my part on behalf of this particular client, and then worked with the claimant's dad to obtain the information that he didn't understand why I needed it.
So this case is, this application process being an individual disability and not a group employer-provided policy is more complicated than a traditional person who's a W-2 type employee and not an owner, like an owner of a business like your client was, because you had to have a lot more financial documentation to get submitted, whereas in most claims the disability company asks for an employer statement to say what was the person earning, what were the duties of their occupation, and those cases are more simple. This one was more complicated, and once you were able to get everything to them, because MetLife wanted the occupational information or the financials because they wanted to determine what was this claimant doing. They wanted to look at P&Ls, tax returns, other types of work documents to try to support what were the duties of your job and see where were you really making your money. You got everything to MetLife, but mental nervous conditions, which is what this is, are highly challenged because at the end of the day they're subjective complaints that it comes down to. Did you get any resistance in this claim from MetLife?
Interestingly, once I submitted the documentation that I had to date, and recall that I didn't want to wait because I had the proof of claim issue, they started to pay the claim for a very short period of time. After a number of months, they had sent a letter to me saying that at this point we're terminating benefits because we've failed to show that the claimant meets the definition of disability. In other words, could not do the duties of his occupation due to a mental or nervous condition. So, the obvious next question is, what did we do?
And what did they rely upon to say that they thought it? They initially said, yeah, we think he's disabled, now we don't. What changed? What did they rely on?
What happened was they included in my packages to them were the psychiatric records. And he had what I would say was a terrific psychiatrist who prescribed the meds, who provided therapy on once, sometimes twice a month basis, and was very involved with the dad so that if the son couldn't communicate everything that was troubling, dad could. And Met ultimately stopped making the payment because they said the medical records were insufficient. The psych records didn't support the claim. And that was problematic. I had the choice early on not to send what I had, which would be an issue as it relates to, number one, cooperation, number two, proof of claim, because those were the psych records that I obtained from dad, or wait. I didn't want to wait because at this point, early on, I wanted to submit everything with the hopes that the medical psych records would be satisfactory. We often don't know if the carrier is going to be satisfied with what we send, because each case is reviewed differently by a different claims adjuster. There are, of course, different companies, different supervisors that will rubber stamp a claim as approved, and different internal roadmaps as to what the carriers do once they receive the medical records. A lot of them review the medical records in-house with their internal medicine doctor or their psychologist or psychiatrist or nurse practitioner in mental health. So not knowing exactly whether or not they would determine that it was satisfactory to reverse the denial, I sent what I had.
Okay, so you were basically, you dealt with the medical records you were given. Now you find out they're not satisfactory. Nothing you could have done beforehand because that's the way they were written.
Correct.
And now you're basically faced with a quasi-appeal to the company to say, how can I get them claimed? And so tell us how you did that and what the outcome was.
After reviewing the psych records, which were cursory, they did memorialize the date of treatment, 1 or 2 or 3 sentences of discussion, and that was basically it. Oh, and then the continue meds or change meds, increase meds, or whatever. I explained to Dad that this is really insufficient, and I understand where med is coming from. A DID claim is such a significant psychiatric disorder that in the ordinary course of psychiatric business, we would hope a doctor would be more specific in the identification of the symptoms, the limitations, the restrictions, and that sort of thing. But remember, doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, why do people go there? They go there for the therapy to get better without the anticipation that this is ultimately going to end up on an insurance company's desk. And the docs are more concerned about treating and spending time in the therapeutic arena than they are in spectacular notes.
So how did you get better notes?
I asked his dad, would he arrange a phone conference with me and the doctor? I offered to pay the doctor for his time because he's busy and he was months out. So the doctor agreed. I had reviewed the notes prior to our conversation. We had a very productive conversation, and I explained to the doctor that the family is very happy with your treatment. However, your notes don't pin the tail on the donkey for what Met is looking for. And he said, in what way? And I explained to him that they're really looking for the specifics of the discussion. What symptoms did you notice on April 12th, April 29th, May 7th, May 30th? He said, well, I ordinarily don't do that. I just note that we had a discussion and therapy rendered an invoice. I said, that's probably fine for a non-disability claim, but when the claim is going to be very heavily scrutinized by in-house psychologists or psychiatrists working for MetLife, I need for you to provide me with more detailed records, which was somewhat problematic because he said, I can't go back and change my records. And I said, doctor, absolutely not. I don't want you to go back and change your records, but would you be willing to provide a summary of the care that you rendered to this patient over the term of your treatment and what your conclusions were, what your findings were? Basically, a narrative covering the entire scope of treatment to date. And from this conversation on, would you be willing to perhaps be more specific in identifying symptoms, restrictions, limitations, and things of that sort, which would satisfy, understandably, MetLife's internal reviewers? And his attitude was, if I can help the patient do that, I will do that. And had I been asked to do that originally, I would have. But the family, of course, didn't ask for that.
Well, it's a classic case of doctors treat the patients, and then the charts are basically just to remind them of what happened last time, what are the patient's complaints, what's the course of treatment going to be to comfort the patient. Like you said, they're not doing it for insurance companies because they don't have to. And they're not doing it with the expectation that a disability insurance company is going to look at it, cherry pick the records and say, this isn't in there, this isn't in there, that's not in there, and then rely upon that to deny. So this claimant was lucky to have you to work directly with the doctor to then educate the doctor to say, this is how records have to be done in order to meet the burden of what MetLife wanted. And obviously when you submitted that over to MetLife, was that satisfactory to them, or did they still want to do more things?
They wanted to do more things. They reviewed it, and it went over a period of weeks, and I was in constant touch with the adjuster. And frankly, the lawyers in our firm know the adjusters from Met. We speak to them regularly on multiple claims. And he had what I thought was a good attitude and said, I'm going to submit this to psychiatric review, but we're going to submit it to a third party as opposed to in-house, which they did. And he also said, in order to pay this claim, I need to have an independent medical examination, which is very common in the application stage. And that's reserved in almost every disability policy, whether it's a group plan or an individual plan, where the carrier, if there's a need for additional information, generally, without giving us an excuse, often can arrange an independent medical exam, which means an interview conducted by a physician of the insurance company's choice.
And did that take place?
It took place.
And so did that physician come back in support of our claimant?
They picked a superstar who was a professor, years of experience, had testified in some of the most noted cases in America, many on the criminal side as it relates to insanity defense and murders and stuff like that, and which is good and bad, because if you get somebody who's amazing in the profession that he practices, you have the possibility of getting somebody who's really going to see a sick individual, or somebody who's credentialed up to the sky could say, look, this is my opinion, and doesn't generally support it well enough. The interview was done, and it took a while for the report to come back. I contacted the adjuster for MetLife, who again was reasonable, and I asked him, would you continue payments at this point under what's called a reservation of rights? A reservation of rights means that we're not going to admit that we're liable under this insurance policy, but as an accommodation to the insured, the person who bought the policy, we recognize that there are issues here. We don't know the severity of them, but during this waiting period, we will start making payments. And they did.
And so you got payments to continue again?
Yes.
During that stage, and
But
eventually,
under a reservation.
and then shortly thereafter, I'm assuming this report from what was supposed to be an independent medical examination doctor came back favorable for the claimant.
Well, actually, it didn't come back 100% favorable for the claimant. The report, which was multiple pages, did identify issues that this particular patient was having. And while the examining doctor didn't come out and say, yes, he meets the definition of disability, and I would propose that you pay this claimant, there was a lot of meat in the report that when I got it, I was able to forward to his treating psychiatrist and ask him to comment on it, and what does he agree with, what does he disagree with, and call it like you see it, which he agreed to do.
And based upon that, did that convince MetLife to remove the reservation of rights and approve the claim?
His treating psychiatrist did painstakingly go through every paragraph of the report, explained what he agreed with, what he disagreed with, differentiated the disagreement versus the agreement as to why he thought the examining physician, who didn't really know the patient, how well can you know a patient in 2 hours? Ultimately, the answer to your question is MetLife reversed. They sent me a letter and said, we're going to remove the reservation of rights. We're going to pay him. And as we sit here today, he gets his monthly benefit.
Well, that's fantastic. I know it was a long road, and we try to briefly summarize it here, but I remember when you and I were discussing the claim and bouncing back and forth on issues, it was a very stressful time, especially for the claimant, and these psychological claims are highly challenging due to the subjective nature. And even when they went out and got a doctor, the doctor still was like, portions of it, yes, this person can go back to work, and still had to do a lot of behind-the-scenes work to convince MetLife, hey, this particular claimant cannot do the duties of his occupation and you should pay, and that was the way it went. So congratulations on a great outcome. If you're someone out there who has a MetLife disability claim, feel free to reach out to myself or Steven. No matter where you live in the country, we're available to assist you, and we'll always provide you with initial free phone consultation.